had my junior level students from several semesters in my Survey of African American Literature class visit the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. collection and to locate an article by Dr. King entitled Out of the Night of Segregation. To guide them in this examination of the essay, I start out by giving them a series of what I call very basic questions. The questions that I give them are meant simply to give them some basic information concerning the facts of that particular essay. So I have them tell me what is the name of the periodical in which that essay appears. All right. This particular essay, Out of the Night of Segregation, appears in a journal called Lutheran Women's Work. And then another basic question that I ask them is, in what type of periodical did this essay appear? And they see that this particular journal, Lutheran Women's Work, is a monthly journal. And then another basic essay, or another basic question is, what is the publication date of this periodical in which King's essay appears? And they see that it's February 1958. And then finally, another very basic question that I want them to be familiar with is who appears to be the primary audience for this periodical. And of course, that's very easy considering the title of the journal. Women who are part of the Lutheran Church. So one of the things to consider as you're doing any primary research and looking at the archives, always try to get basic information about the text that you're searching. Before you can do any analysis, you need to have that background information. So that's usually what I ask them to focus on first. The next set of questions are meant, however, to help them to explore what can be very telling aspects of seemingly ordinary facts. In other words, with these second set of questions, they are encouraged to think critically about the facts. So, in other words, I will give them those basic questions and then I'll ask them, since King, for example, was part of the African American Baptist Convention in 1958, what might be the editorial, why might the editorial staff of this publication have chosen to include this essay? So you would think, here he is, part of the African American Baptist Convention, and yet his piece is being published by women on Lutheran Women's Work. So that leads to the question, why? Another question I asked them to investigate is in 1958, because the article was published in that year, where was King in terms of his work in the civil rights movement? Right, you always want to be aware that the line that Dr. King was constantly growing and developing and reshaping many of his ideas and building upon those ideas. So we look at the fact that that essay was published in 1958 and then try to identify where was he in terms of his work. Was he just beginning as a leader in the civil rights movement? Was he deeply entrenched in it already? That becomes an important issue. Another question that I like them to consider is, why would the editorial staff of this journal believe that its audience would even be interested in King's essay? If you consider that perhaps the primary audience happens to be women who are Lutheran, why would they be interested in this particular essay by an African American Southern preacher? Right. So after the basic information, it is this type of questioning that I want students to begin thinking about. Then once they have answered those basic questions and they have tried to investigate their responses to these questions, when they return to class, I build our discussions around the questions here, hoping to help them develop more fully their answers. What I have discovered is that their initial answers tend to be a bit shallow because they're not informed by considerations of the biographical and historical information that they know about King, the civil rights movement, and about the time period in which King's writings appeared in the publication. However, during the process of class discussion, as I am reminding them of important historical considerations, their answers to the critical questions become examples of true engagement with the primary source, with King's text. In other words, what I mean by that is, as we are looking at these questions, most of the answers that I receive from my students tend to be very shallow answers. Again, answers that don't include, again, knowledge that they already have about Dr. King and about the civil rights movement. So our class discussion centers around answering these questions, again, with some understanding of the history behind them, or how history can inform the answers. So take, for instance, this first question. In our discussion of that particular question and their responses to it, what I do is I say, okay, look at your history, look at the history. What do you know about Dr. King? What do you know about the civil rights movement? What do you know about the social environment in 1958? And once we consider those issues in connection with their response to that question, their responses become a lot more enlightened, so to speak. And these are some of the responses that they end up giving me as they revise their answers. Since King was part of the African American Baptist Convention in 1958, why might the editorial staff of this publication have chosen to include the essay? Well, one answer was the Lutheran Church's recognition of the universality of King's ideas. I thought that was a profound response. Another response that they gave as to why the editorial staff of this particular journal might be interested in King's essay was that the Lutheran Church's recognition of King's ecumenical aims. He wasn't simply interested in racial reconciliation, he was interested in reconciliation in all areas, including denominationally. And then another answer to this question was the Lutheran Church's dedication to racial reconciliation, that perhaps says something about the Lutheran Church that it was willing, as early as 1958, to include a piece by Dr. King. Right? And I think that's very interesting because we hear a lot about the Catholic Church and its involvement in the civil rights movement. But how much do we hear about the Lutheran Church? And then I thought this was very interesting coming from an all-male class. Perhaps one reason the editorial staff of this journal wanted to include Dr. King's essay was that it was the desire of women, particularly Lutheran women, to have a greater role in the civil rights movement. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, that one way to get involved, if you're not marching, if you're not protesting, is to at least embrace those who are. All right? And so just that little bit of factual information led to these wonderful answers. One of the things I think is interesting, though, is that not only did their work in the King collection lead them to profound responses to basic facts about the publication, but it also gave us an understanding, both my students and me, it gave us an understanding of how to do primary research effectively. Right? So looking at the archives is not merely about getting content, but it's also about how do you do research and how do you do primary research and how do you do it effectively. And we came away with these three, I would say, basic guidelines for how to do primary research. In order to do primary research well, you have to have knowledge of historical context and biographical details because they provide the basis for drawing solid, informed conclusions from primary sources. If you forget everything that we have discussed here, I want you to remember that when you go to any archive to do any sort of work, and you're looking at a document, your ability to understand that document is going to depend on you having historical information, biographical information to inform your conclusions. You don't simply look at a document, then come up with a conclusion, and then that's it. But how does history inform your conclusion? Because not all conclusions are created equal. All right? You have to be informed. Another guideline that my students and I came up with in terms of how you do research, how you do effective primary research, is to understand that facts from primary sources can be used to draw multiple conclusions. In other words, factual details speak to the complexity involved in examining primary sources. And that's a really important issue, and I want you all to remember that as you look at the archives, as you do archival work, that there's not just one answer. That the facts that you see, in many ways, they are speaking to you about multiple answers. And that's the great thing about archival work. It encourages you to deal with complexities and not just simply settle for simple answers. And then a final guideline that we came up with together regarding how to do primary research, and that is the conclusions identified from facts can serve as opportunities for further research. That's another beautiful part about doing archival work, because you learn what would be other areas of exploration. For instance, if we go back to this slide here, one of the things I have my students do after we have looked at a text by Dr. King is I want them to do further research. I want them to come up with original research questions. And some of their responses to the questions that I've posed them initially open the door for more research. So, for instance, if you look at the second bullet point, for example, part of the reason that King's journal or essay was included in this particular journal may be the Lutheran Church's recognition of King's ecumenical aims. So what I ask students to do in order to do further research is to turn that into a question. And then let that be a question by which you do research. So for instance, was Dr. King concerned about ecumenical interaction? Or how concerned was Dr. King regarding the reconciliation of different denominations? That's an original research question. Or take, for instance, the very last one, which I think is fascinating. How involved are women, particularly women from the Lutheran Church, how involved were they in the civil rights movement? Again, that is an original research question. Probably one that maybe a lot of people haven't done. So archival work not only opens the door to helping you see complexity in basic facts and how those facts speak to us, but it also opens the door for you to do more research, to come up with additional research avenues to explore. One of the things that I think may also be helpful to you when you think about doing archival work, let's see. I can't seem to get this to working, but there is a website produced by Beacon Press. Many of you may have already visited. It's produced by Beacon Press, and it's called King Legacy, www.kinglegacy.com. And in that website, it gives you a very concise timeline of Dr. King's activities from birth to his assassination. And when you're doing archival work, particularly with Dr. King, what can help is if you have that timeline in front of you. And then that way, when you are looking at a particular piece by Dr. King, you can kind of compare that text with what you know about his life. And then that way you have historical information informing your examination of the archives. So the great thing here we have at Morehouse is that the King collection helps us to do that type of archival work, which opens the door for both instructors and for students to do a lot of creative work in the area of research and Dr. King. Many people think that everything has been said and everything has been done about Dr. King, but the more you look at the resources in the King collection, the more you realize there's still a lot of work left undone.